Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. We're excited that you're here and joining us. Our topic today is continuous testing, a critical part of the DevOps process. My name is Mitch Ashley, and I'm serving as your host and moderator. A few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll be emailing a link to the recording following the webinar. We also have an ebook that we'll be sending out as well, so hang tight for that. We definitely want to encourage everyone to ask questions for our listeners or for our speakers, excuse me. We love questions, and we're going to be talking about this topic, but it very much helps if you toss in your thoughts, ideas, questions of how we can help talk about this topic even better. Now let's move on to our topic, continuous testing, a critical part of the DevOps process. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our speakers. First is Elise Carmichael. Elise is Vice President, Enterprise Evangelist for Tricentis. And we have joining us Vincent Lussenberg, Director of DevOps Strategy at Zebia Labs. So welcome. Let's start out by first having Elise introduce yourself. Elise?
Great, thank you. So like I said, my name is Elise Carmichael. I'm the Vice President of Enterprise Evangelism at Tricentis. I was actually a developer for a really long time and still am at heart. I used to run projects as technical lead, and in my role prior to Tricentis, I ran an engineering and testing organization at a services company. So I've been at Tricentis about 2.5 years, was doing product strategy up until recently, where I've been working more with our sales and marketing team and our larger enterprise customers to make sure that they are successful. And let me just tell you a little bit about Tricentis. I'm sure everyone on this webinar has heard of it. But just in case you haven't, Tricentis was founded originally as a services company in 2007, but a couple years after we were founded, we just delivered our first product to market. It was called Tricentis Tosca and still is. So this is our flagship scriptless automation solution. And since then, we've grown into having quite a few products, all focused around automation and testing. And this helps create our full continuous testing platform, which is what we are known for. So we have over 1,600 customers worldwide, and we're recognized as a leader in the test automation category by all major analysts like Gartner, Forrester, and IDC. And just really quickly, I wanted to tell you a little bit about a couple of our major products. So we have one that we kind of call in our agile dev testing space. So this is called Tricentis Q-Test. It's a test case management solution, but it helps a lot with automation and distributed automation. So we help make your open source frameworks or whatever frameworks you're using more productive and visible and traceable. We have our continuous testing automation platform. This is low code, no code, and it tests end to end. This is Tricentis Tosca, that one that I mentioned earlier. And then we have a distributed load testing tool called Tricentis Flood. So it helps you create and run load tests at scale and as easily as possible so that you can put this as left in your cycle as possible, which we'll probably talk about in a minute. We have a great data warehousing, big data, and business intelligence end-to-end testing tool. So if you're testing a data warehouse, you can actually test all the way from the left side of the process, putting data into your system through your entire data warehousing process, ETL, all the way to your actual charts and graphs in your business intelligence tool, no matter the technology you're using. We're actually just coming out with an RPA product because, as we all know, test automation is basically the same thing as RPA, robotic process automation, except one is in the test environment and one is in the production environment, meant to be with real data. So it made a lot of sense for us to go into that space. So that's all I wanted to mention right now.
Great, wonderful. Vincent, how about introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about Zebia Labs.
Cool, absolutely. So my name is Vincent Lussenberg. I've actually, Elise and I share basically background. I was a software engineer for a long period of time, really in the Java world. Did a lot of agile, so that's really my background. And it's interesting as well that both Tricentis and Zebia Labs have model-based products. A little bit about that. And that's as well as like my background. I've done a lot in model-based engineering, so I'm like still a little bit nerdy about that. So that's fun to have that as a sort of a common theme here in this webinar. I've been part of the Zebia Labs organization since 2011. So I'm originally from the Netherlands, where the company originated. That's where I started working for them. I've been in the US for about 5 years now, based out of Colorado. And what I'm doing right now for the company is really making sure that the direction that our products go in is as relatable to the direction that the market is going to, so that we can support the customers meeting basically the KPIs that they're expected to meet nowadays. So making sure that the time from code commit to production, deployment and production is as fast as possible, but doing it safely, reliably, et cetera, et cetera. So a little bit more about the company. So Zebia Labs as a company has been part of the DevOps movement since basically the early days. We have a DevOps platform that does release orchestration and deployment automation for you. And as a company, we're solely focused on DevOps and continuous delivery. That's really all we do, and we've been recognized as a leader by top analysts in this space in various different locations. We have a global presence. Our customers are across many of the best known and best run companies around the world, and all kinds of industries, financial services a lot, but also retail, manufacturing, public sector, government agencies. So anywhere where people really want to accelerate going into a situation where they can get from commit to production faster in a reliable fashion. And specifically focused on this webinar, our release orchestration product is quite important. We're going to talk a little bit later about the state of continuous testing right now in the market. What our platform does is allow you to integrate your continuous testing effort into one holistic enterprise pipeline end to end, so that what you'll be able to do is have full visibility on not just your continuous testing campaign and what the state of that is, but all your different concerns as well, making sure that your tickets have been created, that your security checks have been ran. And we create dashboards and reporting around that, so you have a holistic view. Continuous testing is a very essential ingredient in that, and as an industry, we've a lot of growing still to do in that sector. But I don't want to spoil the rest of the webinar, so I'll leave it at that right now.
Okay, very good. I apologize to everyone about my slides here. The GoToWebinar and my computer are having a little discussion about who's going to win, so we'll keep going from there. Well, let's start out with, we throw a lot of terms around in our industry, and everything is a 2 or 3 letter acronym or more. Let's start out with, I think we probably have a pretty good feel what we mean by automated testing, but what do we mean by continuous testing? Who'd like to jump in on that?
I'll take this one. So I'm actually the biggest buzzword hater, I think, of all time, and I even dislike the word DevOps, and I mean that in the most endearing way, because I know that this is on the DevOps.com channel here. So continuous testing, the way that I look at this is thinking about testing throughout the entire planning, development, delivery process. And if I were to take this to a very specific level, what I mean is when people say shift left, they mean do testing on the left side of their development process in the planning phase. When I hear pipeline and continuous testing together, I mean do all of your automated tests in particular order in your build pipeline. And then all the way into production. Once you're in production, you have this shift right mentality where you need to also make sure the basic stuff is running. So not one level above a smoke test suite, make sure all the critical stuff is running in production all of the time. That way you don't have to wait until a server is down or a customer yells at you. There's no reason you can't, test the most important part of your production environment, every couple of minutes or every few seconds even. So that's what I mean, is just kind of putting testing into the core process of everything that you do. Vincent, would you have anything to add to that?
I think that you put it quite eloquently. I don't know, the thing that I could add to that, which I guess you already noted as well, is like the way that we see continuous testing as one of the important ingredients to basically get to a state where you can do more frequent code deployments, basically because it's a very clear, continuous practice that you're doing it multiple times a day, versus very custom testing campaigns that are different from release to release. So really basically addressing the KPIs of getting to production quicker.
Absolutely. I feel like testing kind of gets left behind a lot. So we had this whole, agile movement, and testing completely got left behind in there because not only did we not document anything, testing was kind of an afterthought for a while. And a lot of the testing practices didn't really change. And then now we have this DevOps thing that everyone's doing, and they're hiring their DevOps engineers and they're automating their deployments. And everyone has continuous integration set up, and they're trying to do some sort of continuous delivery. And then now testing really stands out as this huge bottleneck. But if you think about it early and you can automate as much as makes sense, then that's kind of what continuous testing is. I see maybe you lost the battle of the computer versus PowerPoint or GoToWebinar.
I did. I'm back, carrying on, soldiering on, if you will. Well, we'll see. This may be an ongoing battle. I may just leave it as it is, but thanks for understanding. Well, it's let's kind of jump then to, since we have both a shared understanding, or both your perspectives on continuous testing. How would you each describe the state of where we are in adopting a continuous testing approach? Organizations can be at different ends of the spectrum. Maybe some folks are just starting out in automation and getting to a continuous testing approach. Others may be fairly mature at it. Where do you think we are as an industry? Vincent, you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Actually, to answer that, is one of the things that I want to refer to is the State of DevOps report from the DORA research team, 2019, which is actually a really interesting body of work. I think that there's nothing really comparable based on the amount of data that they get to work on to really show not only where we are as an industry as well as where we're coming from. So they've been for 6 years or something like that. And in this case, it coincides with my anecdotal evidence of my feelings for what I've been seeing sort of in the field. And that's actually that what you see in the elite performers, so the people that are very best and actually are having huge productivity and profitability gains for their industries, that they've invested pretty heavily in automated acceptance tests. I mean, almost every organization is already doing automated unit tests, so that's not really that much of an insight, but that's because it's already part of your continuous integration pipelines. It's always been shifted all the way to the left. But the automated acceptance tests are definitely on the rise over the years, and this is definitely going to be a part of your continuous testing strategy. But there's still a lot of test forms that actually are not only that, so the elite performers are really doing what the DORA report mentions, 58% of the teams that are sort of labeled as elite performance, they have automated acceptance tests, where on the low performing group only has 28. So what that tells me, that as an industry, it's clear that as an organization, if you want to perform well, to basically get the benefits that DevOps promises you, so basically faster to production, faster time to recovery, things like that, and going towards the state of automating your tests is definitely the direction to go, because elite performers are far more likely to have automated those tests. But at the same time, what we see, the elite group is only about 20% right now of the interviewed organizations for this report. So there's still a lot of companies that are not quite up to that level. So what that tells me is that as an industry, there's still a lot to gain, not only actually setting up how to do these acceptance tests in a continuous way so that you don't have to continuously execute the various things manually, although there's always going to be a need for some manual things, but the vast majority to have that automated. And I could go into as well performance tests and security tests, which depending on who you talk to, might be part of continuous testing, might not be part of continuous testing. So maybe that's great moment to hand the baton over to Elise. How do you see that, the adoption of acceptance versus performance security testing, and what would you really find part of the continuous testing that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I think I could fill up the remaining time answering this question, but I will try to be brief. So there's a couple of things about this data that I find really interesting. I think what we have is the acceptance test here for the elite group. The 58% seems about right from what I see. So this is what I can imagine this is specifically talking about, are when people write their own Selenium tests, their UFT tests, that basically they're UI tests that test the functionality, maybe API tests also to test the functionality of what their application is supposed to be doing. And we see people doing their best efforts, and this is not a standardized thing. Some companies have a center of excellence or a center of practice, and some distribute testers to teams, although that is getting a little out of style. So what's happening is testers are getting embedded on teams, and they're like going full force into like writing these customized frameworks, and sometimes they're different and distributed, and they're really difficult to maintain and keep up when each team can kind of choose what they're doing. It's kind of like having a separate development product or project, but we don't invest, companies don't invest as much money on testing and a development project for testing as they do for other things, which is kind of where Tricentis has come in with a product called Tosca, where it's like, this is a tool to learn. Anyone can learn it, whether or not they're, high-priced engineers or manual testers without the development background. So that's why I see the acceptance test pretty low. The performance tests and security tests specifically, almost every company that I work with, and I primarily work with enterprise companies, almost all of them have separate teams for performance tests and acceptance tests, so security tests. And they're not embedded on the team, so they don't have necessarily a great sense of the business value of different things coming in every sprint or every release. So they have kind of the same set of tests and security tests and performance tests each time. I very, very rarely have ever seen companies already have a good built-in performance test within their pipeline. And part of that's because they get mixed up on the difference between performance, load, and stress tests. But that's one of the things we wanted to solve with Tricentis Flood. Is the whole idea behind that product is to help you scale and run your performance tests in like a smaller load test to see, what have you done this build or this day that has slowed down the performance of your applications. That's actually one of the hardest things to pinpoint. If you wait until the end of the release and you run all your performance tests and you want to figure out what in the world happened, it's kind of hard to debug when you don't do it. So that's one of the biggest, open gaps. That's the easiest one to fill. And security tests is something that I also don't feel like is super well solved yet. There are a lot of companies that can do some amount of automated security testing. And it's great to see there's open source tools like SonarQube, which it's not full on security, it's more static code analysis, but there's companies like Checkmarks that you can run, a tool. And I know you're very passionate about the security side, so I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I can hear Vincent wanting to jump in.
That's like a boring passion to have. No, indeed, I do have a little bit of background there. And it's actually funny. I just actually read an article about the state of security as well. Is that like one of the problems that companies have actually is that they have too many security tools. So they're different silos and different companies are running different security tests, and that basically, I mean, if you talk, like, I think that's mainly like 2018, it was like the thing that everyone was talking about, DevSecOps, like really embedding security into your enterprise pipeline all the way to production as well. So as CBL Labs, we put a lot of effort in that as well, because we're really aiming at the large organizations and the enterprise pipelines there. So what you really saw there is that the problem that companies have indeed is, just like you mentioned, Elise, is that it's not just a different team that does the security testing, they're vastly outnumbered as well. So generally for every 100 developers you have in a company, you have one security specialist. And the way that I still remember, I'm sure that was the same for you, Elise, like back in the day when we were software engineers, is whenever such a security scan would be done, you would get back like basically a 42-page PDF with very security jargon on like
Yes.
basically what the problems were. Actually worked at companies as well where they sliced and diced that report. That, you know, I only got like 3 pages with vulnerabilities because they didn't want the rest of the people to know what the vulnerabilities were, which is of course like one of the dumbest things that you can do, because that's one sure way to make sure that people are not improving. Because if I don't know that I like there's some kind of security vulnerability in my code, I'm going to do it over and over again and again. So what you really
Oh,
see in the security space, it's a combination of getting the knowledge out of the heads of the security people, embedded into these policies so that they can be automatically checked. And that's a combination of static code analysis, dynamic. There's tooling out where there's actually a lot of interesting security tooling being like sort of invented. For example, I think it's called shift left, that or left shift, one of those. That actually plugs into your application at runtime as well. So that's like live vulnerability monitoring. And if any vulnerability is triggered, they sandbox it in a different way. So all of these different things and practices need to be extracted from the heads of the security professionals, embedded in policies. And like the more tools you have, the harder that is, because they have to embed it in 52 different policies, right? And make sure, as well as like give feedback to developers as fastly as possible, so they can fix it at the moment that they're making these security, that they're making mistakes importing, like for example, security or a library, a third-party library that has a security vulnerability. The more that you can put that to the left, the better.
oh yeah, that the
So it's
Heartbleed
actually
bug.
interesting to see. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Heartbleed
Yeah.
bug was
Yep. Indeed.
a total thing that could have been found with a third-party tool analysis that was an open source framework that someone was using, and it had a known vulnerability in it. So had they actually had in their pipeline something to vet the third-party tools, then wouldn't have been a problem.
Right. Yeah.
You
But
know,
the
one
funny
thing.
thing still, like not to, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Vincent. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll just finish my thought indeed. Don't want to keep talking about security testing all the time if I get on my soapbox, et cetera, et cetera. But the interesting thing that I found about this DORA report is actually only 31% of even this elite performance do this automatically. And this really blew my mind. For performance tests, like colloquially, I kind of saw that. It's not like something that's happening all the time. Acceptance tests can be like kind of hard to embed as well. Organizations need to have like a certain amount of expertise in that. But there's so much security testing currently happening, and that it's not automated in the pipeline was kind of surprising to me.
Yeah, I was talking to someone who's a head of security at a particular healthcare company that had a breach maybe 5 years ago, 4 years ago, and he told me that you have to notify your end users who had their data stolen via snail mail. And he said they spent over $1 million just in stamps. So that's shocking that that's still such a low percentage.
One thing I noticed too about this report, and I'm going to stay in the same report forever, but the difference between high and elite in most of the categories is not a huge number. It's usually 10% or less between those two categories. So depending on how folks kind of rated themselves on the scale. And even in the low side of it, clearly with 64%, 57% in automated build and automated unit tests, people are taking that automation seriously. It's that place where they get started and kind of move up this maturity curve. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, either of you.
Yeah, it's really hard to get started on some of these frameworks. So like say if we look at the acceptance tests, it went up about 30% between low and elite, but kind of stayed at this limiting point, even though it's a very straightforward problem, and it's something that we've been solving with tools and code for since I started writing code. But it's so hard to maintain and get a level higher. So as the developers are writing code and you have to say test all of this code. Not only are you testing the new stuff and the old stuff, now the level of complexity is going up as well. So there's just more stuff. So it's real, you're like playing this catch-up game forever. The thing that is fascinating is the performance test is such a straightforward problem. Like I can't harp on that enough. Is it's the simplest thing. You know, you could go invest in a team to help automate these performance tests and put them in your pipeline, and it takes a week. You know, it's the least amount of effort and the biggest bang for your buck you could possibly put in. So it's shocking to me that that's 28%.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well. Is the more that you do these performance tests, the better trend analysis you can do. And I don't know if you agree with that, but like generally in performance tests, like for example, I would say like less is more in the sense of like not doing this huge performance testing campaign that takes like a performance engineer a week or something like that, but rather like really focusing, okay, like what's the I don't know, how do I cover 80% of my most important use cases, and how can I just easily do that test in like sort of a fixed time, right? Like for example, say I'm just like grabbing numbers out of thin air, like 30 minutes to do my performance test. How much of my system, how much relevant tests can I do in 30 minutes, and how can I make sure that I do that every single time? And maybe 30 minutes is actually way too much, but I think there's a lot more interesting, like usable data that comes from that versus doing these larger campaigns where you have a lot of new data that you have to like analyze in a vacuum.
Absolutely. And you know what I see missing on here is integration tests and end-to-end tests. That's probably the least automated thing that I come across at any company, because you're testing across different types of tools and platforms. So if you're testing a Windows app or some point of sale software like within a store. So I'll take like if I want to order a coffee online from a popular coffee producing store, you know, I might use my mobile app and order something. So now I have to test, you know, my iOS app or my Android app. It needs to like access a whole bunch of different third-party services as well as the company's services. It needs to go into the point of sale machine within the store. That thing needs to work offline and process its own payments and refunds, and has to go to their, you know, ticket printing system so it can print something and put it on my drink. And testing like this whole end-to-end process, I almost never see automated. And so although we have acceptance tests up here, I don't see integration tests or system tests or anything like that. So that's another thing that I think is a huge gap. And that's where, of course, Tricentis helps to fill a hole, because it works across different technologies. So it works across iOS and Windows and web. But that's a thing that if that doesn't work, there's kind of no point in deploying anything at all. So I think that's woefully underestimated.
We should talk to the DORA team, have them measure that next year. Curious.
Yeah, absolutely.
It would be great to see. Do you think sort of the test-driven development methodology, which is probably more focused around unit testing, I'm guessing, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that sort of take more of the focus off of the integration and system testing? You think that's why we see less automation, or do you have a sense of why that's the case?
I think it's just a hard problem. You know, if you want to test a Windows app against a web app, it's too many technologies that you have to orchestrate in time, and it's very difficult. But you want to talk about TDD and BDD, Vincent?
Oh, I'd love to, like all day long. No, it's definitely.
Well, let's define TDD is a test-driven development. BDD is behavior-driven development, correct? Yeah.
Yep, that's right. I mean, the most that I have a direct feeling with, especially with my background as a software engineer, is the test-driven development, which in this case, the test-driven development cycle is something that really happens in the developer's IDE, their development environment, right? So it's before any of the continuous delivery pipelines that we tend to talk about a lot in the DevOps space. It's really like as you're working on code. So the test-driven development methodology basically means is like you can't even touch production code if you don't have a test that's failing right now. So before I write a new feature or I fix a bug, I first write test code that prove that the feature is not there yet or that the bug is not fixed yet. So basically you always go through that cycle of you wait until there's something red, there's a failing test, and then you fix that. So from that perspective, I would say that adds a ton of value to the quality of your system. But at the same time, what Elise was mentioning before as well, there's always system boundaries, right? So the moment that a developer is writing tests like these, that it's almost always against like a mocked endpoint. You're not talking to an actual third party or an external system, simply because the tests wouldn't be performant then in that case. You have to reset test data and all of that jazz. So although it is a really great strategy because you can shift it all the way left, which is the best thing ever. The faster you can find problems in your code, the better. But at the same time, it's only appropriate to discover certain type of bugs, so things that are wrong in like sort of the business flow that you as a developer are writing. If your assumptions are incorrect about your external data, no amount of test-driven development is really going to discover that for you, because that's the subsequent phases where you really do these integration tests. So what I sometimes see is that organizations make the mistake of going for like one specific testing strategy as the silver bullet. So we're just going to go to 100% test coverage in unit tests, and then we will solve world hunger. And that's actually not the case. So you have to really think. It's the same thing with the performance test. If you have a limited resources, if you have only like I'm just pulling something out of the air as well. If you want to spend 1 FTE writing tests, okay, how would you spread that? How much test-driven development would you want? Like how much of the gravity of your test set would be there? And what are the other important characteristics of your system, the high risk integrations that you also wanna test? So that's my initial thought on that. Do you want to say something about BDD, Elise? I know that you guys just wrote a report and saw that actually the amount of people that are doing BDD is going down.
Yeah. So really quick to mention one more thing about TDD. I am a huge, TDD fanboy in that if you are writing code and you write the test first and it passes. But honestly, the best part of all that is how good it feels when all of your tests turn green.
Yes.
Because you wrote on the code. There's something just so rewarding about that. So if anyone on the webinar, you know what I'm talking about.
I still have like the dopamine drip of like red going to green. It has really like a strong effect on me. But
totally, it's like getting a you've got mail message or ping on your phone or something. So BDD, this behavior driven development, is kind of an interesting thing. So Tricentis even has a product that supports BDD, specifically a framework called Cucumber. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a way to write tests at a higher level, so that a business analyst or whoever's writing out your user stories can write the requirements of what you're building as a test. So you don't have this extra layer of communication to say, here's my definition of done. It's just written out in words. Then the tester goes and writes their own test cases based off of that. It's actually all just one thing, and there's only one source of truth. And the syntax is called Gherkin in the most popular type of BDD framework. And it will look something like given, when, then. So given I have logged into my application, then I click the button to navigate somewhere else. Or when I click the button to navigate somewhere else, then that new screen opens. So something like that, but it can obviously get into a very detailed sense. And it's kind of a subset of TDD, because the idea is as soon as you write all of these tests, you're writing them as requirements for your user story. And that user story has not been developed yet, so it all should fail. And in fact, the frameworks that support this, you can actually run tests where those steps aren't implemented, and so everything fails, and you have that same kind of dopamine rush of once the code's written and once the tests are written, then it all passes and you can feel good. And I've seen this work really well at a few organizations where everybody is on board, the entire engineering team, testing team, the BAs or product people, anyone writing the stories. Everyone has to be totally bought into this. And the problem that I see most of the time with this is that not everyone wants to do it, or it's only partially adopted, or the testers are going off and writing their own Gherkin syntax, which kind of defeats the purpose. Now you have an extra layer for no reason, which makes it even harder. So we did a study along with Techwell, the company that puts on like Star East and Star West in the U.S., the biggest testing conferences. And we had them ask a question about automation testing and if they're trying out any kind of BDD framework. And we did the same question last year and this year. And last year, about 34% of the respondents who were doing any kind of automation said we are using Cucumber to do BDD. It was 97% Cucumber, so pretty much everyone. We did the same question this past year, and it was only 22%, so it was a 12% drop, and we had a good number of respondees, so that was kind of a shock. So I'm not 100% sure if this is like a fad or it just happens to be the respondents, but it was such a big decrease that I'm thinking maybe BDD hasn't been successful in enough places or it hasn't been proven enough times for it to be picked up. But it's kind of like adopting Agile or some new methodology where everyone has to get buy-in, and changing people's processes is very, very difficult, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, the drop was, if I recall right, at least it was like 34 to 22%. So it's significant
Yep.
year over year, but it's just between those 2 years. Maybe we'll see next year. Have
Yeah,
people just shifted to something else, or this comes back in vogue and putting resources back on BDD?
absolutely. Absolutely.
We have a question from the audience, and I'm not familiar with this term, so if I mispronounce it, asking about a tool called Tosca, Tosca, Commander, and if you're familiar with that, just this person was asking, heard about it, and
Absolutely.
okay,
Absolutely.
is that a softball
Well,
question to you?
well, I mean, it's the full name is Tricentis Tosca of the product,
Okay.
and it's Tricentis Q-Test. And Q-Test was the product that I ran for quite a while, so I'm intimately familiar with it. In fact, I had bought Q-Test as a customer, and that's how I knew about the company. And so I have known of Q-Test for quite a few years in OSV. So the whole question is just about what Tosca is.
Yeah.
So Tosca is Tricentis's model-based test automation solution. So this is the tool that will help you automate all of your tests end to end. And it actually includes a major feature called OSV. And OSV stands for Orchestrated Service Virtualization. And I realized after talking to a lot of people, this is not a super common term. There are other companies that have products that do something kind of similar, but with a different end goal in mind. And what we use orchestrated service virtualization for within Tosca is to help you set up a stable test environment. So when I talk about that ordering a coffee online example and say I wanted to automate that scenario, but anyone who's done any amount of integration or system testing knows that there's always a couple of weak links. This service is always down, or this one is flaky, or this team is flaky and they're not producing the right stuff, or their stuff breaks all the time, or whatever is keeping you from being able to automate end to end. OSV is a service layer that you can stick in between your application and what your application is integrating with. So you can basically stick this OSV layer in between everything in your system, and you could say, hey, if that integration point is up and running, I want to go talk to it. If it's down for some reason, let me know that it's down, but I don't want to fail all my tests. So let me kind of mock that endpoint of what it would do in an intelligent way. So it's more than just hard-coded mocking. So that's what OSV is, and it's something that almost no one is using, and it's like the greatest testing tool that I have seen that is relatively new in quite a while. So that's something that I really think will get a lot more people on board with using it. And then Q-Test, Tricentis Q-Test is the test case management tool that you can integrate, your security tests, your functional automation tests, your API tests, your load tests, and everything into to have reporting and track things over time.
That sounds like that question was tailor-made for you.
It was, so thank you.
Vincent, we had another question. A listener was asking about other security testing tools like Fortify and X-Ray. You want to comment on either of those two tools or some other suggestions you have for automated security testing?
Oh yeah, I can definitely talk about that, as well as basically from the perspective of the release orchestration product CVL Labs. So what you see that with Fortify and Sonar, right?
X-ray
Fortify
was
and
the other one.
X-ray, yeah.
Yeah.
So what you see that those focus indeed on Fortify is static code analysis, right? So you do that, you can actually do that pretty far left into your in your pipeline. It is a tool that I see come across quite a bit. Actually, I think it's one of the older security tools. I remember that we used it like back in the day, like 5, 6, 7 years ago when I was working for a Dutch bank, that it was like something that was in our pipeline already. So that's a great way to do a certain type of security scanning, right? And I think Fortify does a very decent job of telling the developers as well in their language what the problem is and how it should be fixed. Where X-ray, as I know the product the best, is something that you have as part of your repository. So basically, wherever you store your binaries, right, as you build your application, that can be a Docker image or a WAR file or whatever, that what X-ray does is make sure that there any dependencies and libraries you have in there, that they're automatically scanned for vulnerabilities as well as like even things that you download from the internet, right? So that nothing that has any vulnerability, that you basically nip it in the bud before you can even get it, like build it using Jenkins or something like that. So both of those are very handy tools to have in your organization to make sure that your security violation doesn't even become a violation, but because you can't even build your application with that library that has a vulnerability in there. So I'm a fan of those. Our release orchestration product integrates with them as well. Not as much X-ray because it more like runs on the background. It's something that's transparent. It's like a proxy that blocks the downloads that you don't want. But with Fortify, we can indeed validate as part of your pipeline an explicit call out that checks that the code that we're releasing right now, that was in fact checked by Fortify, that there's no critical violations there. If there are critical violations, you can still like waive them so that, but that ends up in your audit trail. So you have a lot more feeling on what's really happening with the state of security in your various applications. But those are both like specific perspectives into vulnerability scanning, and there's much more. So a really cool thing about the last like sort of 2 years is that a lot more tools basically were created, were launched that do more dynamic testing, and as well that actually run in your production environment. And as some kind of vulnerability hits you anyway, because 0 days get discovered in libraries that you might be using, that no matter how that is actually being leveraged by an attacker, that's still like sandboxed in a specific way that it actually doesn't become a problem for your organization. So those are 2 great examples, but there's definitely much more to create a good security blanket that covers all different angles. As I'm saying that, I'm realizing as well that generally companies have the problem of having too many security tools. So there's an optimum there that probably is something that we need to discover in the next couple of years.
I think that's something a lot of organizations wrestle with. If we could, I'd like you both to step back for a moment and think about, the kind of career dilemma of people doing testing, and automated testing has always been too late in the development cycle, and traditional development cycles of not having enough time to do thorough enough testing or developing all the tests that you'd like to do. How much has automation, how much has DevOps or Agile or other changes in how teams work, integrated tool chains and workflow pipelines, how much has that helped us move that, doing more quality testing earlier in the life cycle of software releases? Have we improved significantly? We still have a long ways to go. Elise, do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, when people talk about shift left, I think what they usually mean is that they want to automate everything within the sprint. And a lot of the problem that I see teams have in adopting something like this is they don't even necessarily have to use something like BDD. You can use Tosca, you can use Selenium, whatever you want to automate within the sprint, but you have to get the whole team's buy-in to do something like this. If you don't leave enough time in the sprint, so say you have testers or software developers and test assets who are writing automation tests, and they can't test something because it wasn't done until the last day of the sprint, you're not going to be successful. So a lot of it is a planning problem. You can also have developers do automation, but then you're writing features more slowly, and so it's also hard to get buy-in that way because now you're slowing down your time to market of new things. So you really have to get the whole team on board, and that's still the hardest problem. The idea behind BDD is you automate all that stuff in sprint, otherwise your tests have failed and you shouldn't be able to have a release or completed sprint without working code. So it's not there yet, but I know that's where teams want to be, so it's just a matter of changing that mentality.
So first is getting that buy-in across the team of how much we want to shift left, if you will, and how we're going to do this together. So it's part of an integrated development team process, not a test team unique thing. Is that the message?
Exactly.
Okay, great. Vincent, what are your thoughts about where are we on this kind of moving up the value and importance and the amount of testing we do?
Well, actually, that's from the perspective that I have right now working for Zebia Labs. What I see is a lack of integrations with acceptance testing, integration testing, performance testing. Security is like one of the things that I quite see a lot of. So right now, from the perspective that I have separate from the DORA report, I think that enterprises still have a problem defining integrations with defining an automated way of saying, like, how do I decide what the state of my testing campaigns are, like sort of more in an automatic fashion. So generally, as I work with the companies, and we mainly cater to like Fortune 500, 1000, right? Testing is not really central in basically the POCs that we run, even like the first 30, 90 year discussion, basically. You see that the focus is mainly on these other things, like making sure that the right tickets get created, making sure that you have the traceability in Jira, doing deployment automation, good solid integration with CI, your entire reporting around everything. But what I kind of find funny is indeed the lack of focus or the lack of examples that I have of really solid integrations with test automation tooling that can actually help me to make an automated decision on what the quality of my release right now is, right? We have integrations to kick off Selenium tests, to kick off like testing campaigns on like various different tools out there, including the Tricentis, the Tosca, Qtest, Flood, things like that. But there's one part like executing the test, and there's the other part of like concluding. Okay, so but what's the quality, right? Like generally, testing is not really a pass-fail. It's the same you see that with security testing, right? You run your security analysis, but that doesn't really mean that you get like a pass-fail that's the same for every different project out there. So you generally want to get some kind of metrics back, right? Like for testing, that could be expressed in how does it compare to my previous releases. Some organizations I've talked to define it as long as there's not like a more than 10% regression compared to previous releases, like it's fine by me. For the rest, I'm going to make sure that the trend goes in the right direction. But I think there's still a lot to be gained, and that it is consistent with what I see in the DORA report, is the lack of conversations that I really have about it right now. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Elise, do you generally concur with what Vincent's saying?
Yeah, it's exactly. It's easy enough to run the tests. So a lot of what we did with the Qtest product is have analysis and metrics in there so that you can see, you know, last release, this is how we did, this is the percent of tests that we got run, because in most products, in most cases, you can't run everything every release that you want to, because it's like an unlimited thing. So you can automate as much as you can. You can then you know, automate the new stuff as much as you can. You can do exploratory tests as much as you can, but there's always more stuff to be done. So you have to stop at some point and know that, okay, I feel confident enough in this release that nothing terrible is going to happen. The button color might not be wrong. I didn't double check the hex or whatever. But that's exactly right. It's hard to track over time how things are going, and so that's a lot of what we've been working on to integrate all the different types of quality tools into Qtest, including Tosca and Flib.
It's going to be super essential for those kind of things to really be embedded in a continuous delivery pipeline, because without that, there's no way to really get a conclusion automatically. And that's
Absolutely.
going to cause delays, and that, yeah, so that's exciting that, you know, the industry is working on that as a whole.
Are there certain metrics that, you know, everyone in software, IT, whatever kind of organizations always trying to find ways to gain additional dollars budget to buy tools like both of your companies provide? Are there business metrics or things that you can help demonstrate the investment and the value that you're gaining from continuous and automated testing? Any experience there?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Elise.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, some of the common metrics you might track are, you know, how many bugs were released every release, and specifically how many bugs of each severity were released. So if you have what I might call a Sev 1 bug, something that is completely broken with no good workaround, you know, that's a really big deal, and you can kind of put a price tag on those because they're much more severe. Sometimes there's penalties and fines involved. To, you know, a Sev 5 defect, which is like my button color is wrong, and, you know, nobody really cares about
Right.
that. It's not going to affect anything. So measuring that stuff is a big one. And when you look at from a business perspective, what you care about is drastically different than what like the testers care about. They don't care, you know, they don't care how many bugs you found. They care about just what went into production and how quickly it went into production.
Right.
So your time to market would be the other big thing. Like how much was the testing team holding you up versus, you know, how was it not a bottleneck? So how long is the development cycle, stuff like that.
Yeah. What I like to relate it to is basically in the DORA reports, like over the years, they basically quote 4 metrics that they see as absolutely essential to basically getting the return on investment on the things that DevOps promise. And that's your code deployments, and talking about production deployments then, and you see that the elite performers do that like 46 times more. But where the major differences that you see is basically the elite performers, they still they fix incidents like something, I think the last report said like something like 2,600 times faster, right? Although the change failure rate is only 7 times lower. So in other words, what does that mean is, as I'm releasing 50 times more into production, I'm still making, there's still a lot of incidents. Partially they're going to be button colors and stuff like that, right? So you're still going to make mistakes, and having like some kind of super ultra prohibitive long testing campaign is not going to really prevent that much. The key is really being able to fix those things faster. So it's choosing correctly is, okay, where do I want to spend my effort? How can I create like a security blanket that covers like 80% of my important functionality, and not care that much about the button colors and things like that, because you have faith in your process, in your pipeline, that if there is a problem, that you can fix it within a day or within 2 days or something like that. First is really going for that strategy of, oh my God, I want absolutely no mistakes to make it into production. No, having failures is fine. That's perfectly acceptable. The elite performance have that as well. It's all about having the right, basically continuous delivery pipeline, your continuous testing, that you can fix forward very, very quickly without like having other regressions, right? You don't want to fix the button color and then something else keels over. So that's, I think, something that I'd like to add there.
Good. I'm curious and interested to hear you say that, Vincent, sort of what's that 80-20, because in some teams, the QA, the testing function, can be seen as we're here to present every problem, that we can possibly find,
Right.
and
Yeah.
someone else's job to decide if this software is worth releasing
Yeah.
or not, good enough to release or not. Sounds like you take a little bit of a different approach, or maybe a very different approach than that.
I think it's a little bit related to what you hear people talking about DevOps as well. It's like what security used to be. Just I don't know. It started with QA. QA used to be more of a gatekeeper, right? Be like, oh no, you can't go into the next stage because this and that is not done, and I don't know, you didn't upload this or that document or something like that. The same what you saw with the security people. There were gatekeepers as well, telling and what DevOps is more doing is moving from this position of you are a gatekeeper to you are an active participant in, like, we all have the same metric, right? We want to have teams that it's not that my QA team focuses on these performance metrics, or for example, that they have to focus on, I don't know, less bugs in production, but the developers have to focus on more frequent deployments or something like that. As a DevOps process, as a company as a whole, you want to have the same metrics. Like, we all have the same goal. We want to have software that is working in production as fast, reliably, safely as possible. So aligning your entire team, not just QA, not just security, just everyone to the same metrics is really what DevOps, in my opinion, is all about. Is people, process, and tools, right? So from that perspective, I think it's really aligned with that mindset of everyone being a contributor to actually getting the software out there versus being a gatekeeper and saying no. In DevOps, you don't say no anymore. You say yes, and these are the requirements.
So, Lisa, if I said the role is not QA, quality assessment or assurance, it's really a team metric about getting the most value delivered to the business and its customers through software that we release from the organization. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I think the role of QA has evolved a little bit from being the scapegoat of they didn't find the bug and so they're to blame if it went into production, to a full team effort of everyone cares about quality throughout the process. It's kind of a shared blame, if you will. I always I keep hearing things like, oh, QA missed this thing, and I'm like, the developer added the thing. Like, it's clearly the developer's fault. They're the ones that added it. I say this as a developer, and there's a huge amount of shame that you have for putting a bug into production. Not that ever happened to me, maybe once or twice. But I think the role has changed, and everyone should be really focused on the business. And it's hard to do that sometimes when you're someone who's focused on, like, well, this is my application. It's sometimes hard to see the big picture, but ideally, everyone has those same reports to see that big picture together.
And one of the things that works really well here, and this is, I think, a principle that goes all the way back to extreme programming back in the day before there was Agile, and it's no blame, but no mercy, right? So we're not just hunting, oh, it was Bob who didn't find it, or it was Susan who added the bug or something like that. It's fine, like shit happens. Can I say that on this webinar?
I think you just did.
But it's all about, like, rallying as a team then to actually fix it. So have no mercy basically on putting something in place so that it doesn't happen again, like codify it into your pipeline, having a policy around it, work it into your automated test suite, but not really like the finger pointing, right? So another, like, I'll stop referring to the DORA report soon, I'm sorry, but one of the things that I really see as well is that psychological safety is really, really essential to get in that elite performer group, to be able to indeed call out things of, okay, this is not going right, we need to fix it in a certain way, and not be ridiculed and shamed for that. So actually a low shame organization is, in my opinion as well, colloquially, really, really essential to really make some headway with this.
Well, with that, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up. It's been a great hour of conversation, and I just can't believe how much great information and knowledge you both shared with us and with the audience. I've certainly learned a great deal listening and talking with you. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and thanks for the great questions from our audience. Just a reminder that we'll send out a link to the recording of the webinar, and also there's an ebook that will be coming out on continuous testing that we'll send out as well. So I'd like to thank our two panelists today, Elise Carmichael, Vice President, Enterprise Evangelist, Tricentis, and also Vincent Lussenberg, Director of DevOps Strategy at Zebia Labs. It's been a great webinar, and thank you for your contributions. And of course, thank you to our audience, our listeners, for your participation. Your time is super valuable, and I hope we've spent it well. I think we have. It's been my pleasure being your host today. Have a great day and be careful out there.
Thank you, Mitch. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.